Hey Defenders, welcome back. In this video, I want to show you guys how we can install OpenCTI. And OpenCTI, if you're not too familiar with it already, is a platform that we can use to really store, organize, visualize, and also share knowledge about cyber threats. And in future videos, this one will just cover a install of OpenCTI, but future videos I'll show you guys also how to connect to your MISP instance so we can bring in MISP events, connect to your Hive instance so we can actually bring in real cases and events happening with our data center, and then use OpenCTI to view any related artifacts to our events. And it's really just kind of a unified platform for all your levels of cyber threat intelligence. And there's a ton of connectors that we'll focus on in later videos. So we first need to go ahead and actually install this. So our goal in this video will be I'm actually going to install it via Docker, and I'm actually going to kick off a Docker Swarm type of architecture. So I'm actually going to have two VMs that I have stood up. One will be kind of the master, which will still run some containers, and the other will be a member of our swarm. So I'll have two VMs that make up this Docker Swarm architecture, and that will be responsible for running our containers with it that are required for OpenCTI. We're then going to deploy our OpenCTI stack, and then we're going to make sure we can log into our OpenCTI console. And so some steps we're going to take. So we're first going to install Docker on both of our boxes. We will deploy Docker Swarm. We will deploy Portainer to manage our containers. And that'll, if you're not familiar with what Portainer is, it basically allows us to manage our Docker instances and our containers all from a friendly web UI. It makes our lives a lot easier. You can in theory do everything from the command line that Portainer is doing as well, but Portainer makes it a little more user friendly to manage that. I'm going to use that. I'm going to take advantage of that application in this video, and then we're going to deploy our OpenCTI stack. So if we go into OpenCTI's install guide, which I will also link down in the description below, you see there are a few options here for installation. I mentioned I'm going to be using Docker because it is just so much easier. There's other software that OpenCTI requires, such as Elasticsearch, Redis, Mini.io. So you could, if you wanted to, install all of these side dependencies manually if you wanted to, or they have created a Docker Compose file that brings all these applications in for us. So it's a lot easier from our perspective, and I highly recommend going the Docker route to actually deploy CTI. But enough of that, let's actually go ahead and jump into it. And all right, so I have my two servers here on the right. So again, I said I'm going to be using Docker Swarm, so I'm actually going to be using two VMs to deploy this. You could absolutely do this on one VM, so you could follow these same steps, except you would omit our Docker Swarm steps, which we'll be going through here in a sec, and only deploy it on one VM if you would like. But I like to take advantage of Docker Swarm and two VMs just to give you some higher redundancy, help keep resources down, such as memory and CPU, down to a minimum on your two boxes, because this it is bringing in a lot of technology, right? If we look at go back to their dependencies and everything that they're bringing in, right? It's not lackluster. And these boxes that I've stood up are about 8 gigs of memory and 4-core CPUs. Both of these guys are, if we see here. So you definitely need to dedicate a little bit of hardware to running OpenCTI, so just keep that in mind. But I do recommend it. It is a pretty sweet tool, especially once you start to integrate it with the Hive and MISP and etc. So as I mentioned, we're going to be going the Docker route. So I've gone ahead and I'll link to the GitHub as well, where I've stripped out some of the important commands that'll get us up and running. So we're going to first run an app update on both of my boxes, and this is a Ubuntu 20.0.4 box that I am installing this on. So we are first, in these steps here, we are first installing Docker. So we first need to install Docker, and that's very easy to do. Right now we're just grabbing the prereqs to be able to install Docker. We're going to grab the GPG key of the Docker repo, and then we're going to go ahead and install it. So I'll paste that curl command there. I'll say yes. Let's continue. Let's check the fingerprint of the key. So we get Docker release and Docker release. Okay, good. Let's add the Docker repo now. And again, this is on an Ubuntu box. If you're deploying this on another operating system, if you go to Docker documentation, you can select the operating system of your choice. So I'll go into the Docker for Linux, and you'll see the other distributions of Docker here as well. So if you're deploying like on a CentOS box, you can go ahead and select that, and you'll have your installation steps here as well. So I'll exit out of that, and we'll continue on. So I added our repo, and now let's run a app update again, and then we'll now be ready to install Docker and Docker Compose. I'll say yes, and then I'll install Docker and Docker Compose on VM number 2. Then I'll go ahead and copy this Docker version now just to make sure that Docker has been installed properly. So if we paste that in, that looks good. You see I grabbed version 20.10.12. If we do it on box number 2, same result. So that looks good. So now let's create our Docker swarm, and this can be on either box. In my case, I'm just going to install it on what I've called OpenCTI 01, and then this box I've called OpenCTI 02. So I'm going to make the manager node of my swarm be on 01. So, and Docker Swarm is really easy to deploy. It's just a few simple commands here. So we first need to copy our Docker Swarm init, and I'm gonna advertise an address. And here you see I've instructed you guys that this will be the manager IP address. In my case, I'm gonna use my external IP address that is assigned to this box. Of course, in a production environment, you would want to keep this internal and not expose it to the internet. But in this demo lab, it's a lot easier for me to just deploy these within a cloud environment and then just tear them down once the lab is over. So I'm going to say our Docker Swarm init, and I'm going to tell it, hey, we're going to advertise on address this 213, which is of my interface ETH0. So I'm going to go ahead and say that, and that looks good. So now we see to add a worker to this swarm, run a following command. So it's really nice. Docker outputs, hey, this is going to be the command that we're going to run on your on the worker node. So I'm going to expand that. Let me actually open up Notepad and paste that here so I can get it all in one line. So go ahead and copy that, and now I will go to my worker node, which will be our OpenCTI 02 box, and paste that command there. And we see this node joined a swarm as a worker. So that looks good. And if we do a netstat, we see our Docker manager is listening on our port 2377. So that looks good. So I'll go ahead and throw this back to the side here. So two simple commands, right? We run the Docker Swarm init on our manager node, and then Docker outputs, hey, this is going to be the command you're going to run on the worker node. So pretty straightforward. So now let's go ahead and actually install Portainer. So I'm going to copy this command to make this directory here, and then I'm going to cd into it. And this only needs to be done on one of the boxes, right? And in this case, I'm actually going to do it on what is the manager node. It can be either node, it doesn't matter. I'm just going to deploy it on here. And again, this tool, because we could do like Docker PS and see our containers that are running. Of course, we have nothing running now. Go ahead and clear that out. But Portainer will allow us to manage our containers and our OpenCTI stack much easier, and you'll see that here in a sec. So I'm then going to curl our Portainer stack.yaml, and this will be the config of what Docker is going to take to actually deploy this. So if we go ahead and open this file up, we see one of the images that we are grabbing. This is a image that will run within our Docker container. So we're grabbing an agent image, then we're also grabbing the Portainer -ce image as well. And the only change we need to make is we actually need to change the ports that we're going to use, because OpenCTI will also try to use ports 9000 and 8000. So to avoid a conflict, I'm just going to add a 1 in front of the 9 and a 1 in front of the 8, so that OpenCTI, when we initialize and start OpenCTI, it doesn't complain at us saying, hey, this port's already in use. I'm going to change that there, and then I'm going to go ahead and save that guy off. And now let's actually deploy our OpenCTI, our Portainer stack. And it's as easy as this. This is what makes Docker so easy and so nice to work with, is you can just run this simple command, and we're pointing to our compose file, our Portainer-agent-stack.yaml, which is the file that we just edited. And this contains all the settings and configuration that tells Docker, hey, this is what I want you to spin up. So go ahead and copy that and paste that there. And now we see Portainer starting to spin up. If we run a Docker PS, you see now our containers for Portainer are starting to spin up. So we'll give that a few seconds, and then we'll be able to log into the web UI of Portainer. And all right, so it's probably been enough time now. It's been about a minute. Let's see. Let me run a netstat and see if it's listening on that port. It looks like it is. Okay, so we're gonna connect to Portainer's web UI on port 19,000 here. So I'm going to grab the IP address of this guy, which is this 213. I'll say HTTP. I'll say 19,000. And now we get redirected to Portainer. So we are now prompted to create our admin account. So I'll just use a username and password here. And I'll go ahead and create user. And now we are in Portainer. And so this is doing, essentially, this allows us from a web UI to interact with our Docker instance running on these boxes, which is really nice. So let's go ahead and actually now deploy OpenCTI. So first, what I'm going to do is actually go to OpenCTI's GitHub page. And let me actually step back one and go into their Docker. So here's their Docker instance, and I'll link to this in the description below. And what we want to grab here is the Docker compose file. And this has all the settings that we will need to go ahead and spin up our OpenCTI. And Docker will do all this for us. So you see us here, we talked about some of the dependencies, such as Elasticsearch that we're going to be bringing in, Mini.io that we're going to be bringing in, the OpenCTI platform itself that we're going to be bringing in. They have a worker, some other OpenCTI related tools, and Redis as well that we're bringing in. So this reflects the flexibility and easy use of Docker. So I'm going to go ahead and select the raw, so I can just Control A and Control C, and I'm going to put that in my buffer. I'm going to go back into Portainer and show you guys how easy it is to then spin up all these containers. All right, so we're now going to jump into our primary environment here, and we're going to go ahead and create a new stack. So we're going to go into stacks here on the left-hand side, and we're going to select add stack. And here you can see the Portainer stack that we just created with this command here, right? So we can deploy a new stack that would be our OpenCTI stack. Yes, we could do that from the command line. Portainer is not a requirement to deploy OpenCTI within a Dockerized environment. I personally like it because I think it makes our lives a lot easier. So I'm gonna go ahead and add a stack. I'm gonna give it a name of just OpenCTI. And here within our web editor here, I'm going to paste our Docker compose file that we just copied from here. Right, so I'm gonna copy and paste that in there. And now you will see all of our settings for OpenCTI. And this will be the config that Docker will read to deploy our OpenCTI stack, right? So we're bringing in our Elasticsearch, our Redis, the mini IO, RabbitMQ. And what's really nice and again flexible about Docker is it'll bring all of this in for us. But we first need to deploy some environment variables. So if we go back into OpenCTI's Docker GitHub here, we will need to grab the .env .sample. We're going to need to change these ourselves. So what I'm going to do is just open these in a raw form, and I'm going to these into a notepad here, and then we can go ahead and make our changes here, and then we will upload it to our Portainer web UI here in a sec. So so I'm first going to change the admin email, say info@opensecure.co. I'll give it a password of please subscribe 123. And here you can see there's some environments that we need to change, and some of these we need to set a UUID. So if we go back to their GitHub, I think they link what fits what. Yeah, so here we can see the mandatory parameters to fill, and some of these require a valid UUID, and we can just randomly generate this. So let me actually throw these two to the side. I'll search for a valid UUID v4 generator and select this top link here, and then we can we can generate a UUID, and then it gets pasted here, and then we can just copy and paste. So wherever we see that a valid UUID is needed for this certain parameter, we'll set that here. So our admin token needs a valid UUID, so I'll go ahead and paste in what I have. Our root user, so for mini IO, just say admin, and I'll just do the same password here. Of course, you would set this to your own liking. RabbitMQ, I'll just leave a guest, and the rest of these environment variables will just be UUIDs. So we'll just go ahead and generate new ones for each of these values here and just paste them in. And I'm gonna go ahead and remove the SMTP hostname variable, and then I'm gonna go ahead and save this, and I'll just call it opencti.env. I'm gonna go ahead and save that file, and then we're gonna go ahead and upload it to Portainer. So it should be done with that generator, and we'll come here, and if we scroll down just below where we pasted in our Docker compose file, you'll see our environment variables. So you can either manually add these such as so, or you can load it from a .env file. So I'm going to paste the one that we just saved. And so here you can see all of our environment variables being loaded in. And that's all that we need, right? This is how easy it will be to deploy the OpenCTI stack. So we have our Docker compose, that all looks good. And then we scroll down, we have our environment variables, and that looks good. And now let's just select deploy the stack. So now what Portainer is doing is telling Docker to go ahead and create this stack. So we get our deployment in process, and if we start to look at the VMs themselves here and run like a Docker PS, we'll see our containers start to be being spun up. So we see our OpenCTI worker, we see one of their connectors that they bring in by default. We see our RabbitMQ being spun up, and if we go to our worker node, we'll see containers being spun up here as well. So this is what Docker Swarm is responsible for doing. It is kind of load balancing our containers and what hosts are being spun up on. If we run a htop to look at system resources, so we can see CPU is starting to spike up a little bit. Memory isn't bad right now. Memory isn't bad on O1 memory consumption, but if we jump onto O2, we see memory has reserved almost 5 gigs. So I'm sure the Elasticsearch container is probably running on this guy, and yeah, here we see it here. And then if we actually go into the OpenCTI stack, we can also get a little bit of health, right? So we can monitor, and what's nice about Portainer as well is you can kind of easily monitor your containers and whether they're up and running. Like if we select the containers on the left here, you see all of our containers that are being deployed within our stack. And it's as easy as that. So now we should be able to access OpenCTI from our web UI. So again, let me get the IP address, the external IP address of this guy. I'm going to copy that, load there, and then by default, I believe it, and then by default it spins up on HTTP port 8080. You will be directed to our login page. So now we need to log in, and our username and password is going to be what we specified within our environment variable. So if we go into editor, you'll see my admin email and then my admin password. So I'll go ahead and use these credentials to log in. So if we paste that there and paste that there, we are now into our OpenCTI console, and they have a pretty sweet looking dashboard, especially once you start to populate this with some data. It looks really cool. So we now have OpenCTI installed, and it's as easy as that using Docker, especially. That's why, again, I heavily advocate using Docker to deploy this. And then here, if you go into our data and then our connectors, you'll see a few of the default connectors that they bring in. I'm going to touch on connectors and how we can add connectors to this, such as MISP, such as the Hive, for example, so that now we can start to import data into this, because now we're not seeing any events or threats. We just have a vanilla OpenCTI installed. So now we need to start to populate it with some data, which I will do in the next video. And that'll wrap it up for this video. And I appreciate you guys hanging out with me, and I will see you in the next one.